Well, good afternoon, everyone. This is Jeff Gould, and I'm really excited to talk about this new resource that we've put up for everybody. Now, the CPQCC report is a really great source of information on our high-risk infants, all kinds of stuff on outcomes and risk factors. The problem is that only about 30 or 40% of the infants that you take care of are really high risk. So what about the other infants that you take care of, the other 70%? What do we know about them? Well, a couple of years ago, some of the CPQCC members really asked us if we could do an all baby data set that would give them at least some information on who they were taking care of and how much work they were putting in for these infants that aren't reported in the high-risk infant data set. What I'm going to do is try to demonstrate the focus boards that show you some of the important information that you can get from looking at this. When we log on to this demo, the first thing you see is the equity dashboard, but then we go over and we click here, and you'll notice that one of the things you can do is you can get focus boards. So we'll get a focus board, and then within the focus board, All NICU Admits. This demo NICU had 705 admits in 2020. And here are the top 3 diagnoses that they had. And if you click on it, you'll see more details that their top admission reason for all of the babies in their NICU was respiratory. So you can get a quick picture of, oh, here's how many kids we admitted, and here's the top 3 diagnoses. Now, if we go over to here, the first thing we can look at is NICU admits by birth weight. What it shows is by birth weight, the actual number of births in your hospital, the number of NICU admits, and of course, the number of inborn NICU admits. So from this table and its companion table, you might want to know for this particular gestational age, how many kids were born in our hospital, how many did we admit, and how many of those admissions were really low risk versus high risk NICU admissions. For me, the exciting thing comes when we look at the first graphic. And this is a graphic that's showing inborn NICU admissions relative to births over time. If we hover, it gives us the number of admits, the number of inborns, and in the denominator. We could also ask the question, well, what percentage of low acuity births did we admit? This is the percentage of all of your admissions that were low acuity. This particular unit happens to be a regional unit, and so they wanted to see how they could compare to regionals. If you're a intermediate or community, you'd be able to do the same thing. So we click on this, and then all of a sudden we see what the relationship is of their low acuity inborn admits as a percentage of all of their NICU admits as compared to the rest of the regional centers. Now, one of the things that you might want to do, what are the details, like what really went on with our admission rate in 2019? And so then we can look at a funnel chart. I'll go back to all of the. So here is the percentage of low acuity relative to the inborn NICU admits. And you could see for this particular NICU, 70.5% of their admits were low acuity. And then they can compare them to other NICUs in the network. Now, this was 2020. Let's look at 2019. Again, here's our NICU compared to the rest of the population, but maybe we'd like to look through time. And so we can cycle through time, and you'll see this little animation. We start off in the 2008, 2000. You'll notice on the bottom of the total number of inborn NICU admits, and then the percentage of those admits that were low acuity. One of the reasons that people like to look at this is to see whether when their census falls, are they padding it with a lot of low acuity NICU admits? And you can see from this little animation that there's no such indication that anyone's doing anything except appropriately admitting kids. Of course, one of the things you might want to know is, who are these kids that we're appropriately admitting? What are they? And so we can then click on the reasons for admission. And again, we'll go to 2019. So we're going to look at all low acuity admits and ask, what are the major reasons we're admitting? And here is rank ordered: respiratory distress, a suspected infection. So 29% of our kids were for respiratory distress and 26% for infection. And we can compare that to all participating NICUs or to all your community NICUs. And you can see the ranking is based on everybody. And then you can see if your ranking follows suit. Not only do you get the percentage of kids by each diagnosis, but also their mean length of stay, as well as the minimum and the maximum in your NICU. So it's kind of interesting that some kids, like neonatal abstinence syndrome, were only 13 out of the 511 kids, and that's only 2.5%. But their average length of stay, their mean average length of stay, was 17%. So that's pretty interesting. But when you're looking at diagnoses in the NICU, it's nice to know averages for everybody, but we know that depending upon your gestational age or your birth weight, the kinds of illnesses that we're faced with are really quite different. So to get a sense of what's going on by gestational age or by birth weight, we go to the next thing, which is called the heat map. And with the heat map, the darker the color, the more we're talking about. So now we're looking at all low acuity NICU admits in 2019. And you can see the birth weight and gestational age policy is probably the biggest. Oh, respiratory distress, we had 108. Suspected infection, we had 98. You wonder if there's a difference between the diagnoses of the kids that you admit inborn versus outborn. So we could actually look at that. We could look at inborn low acuity. Some of the big folks are hypoglycemia, again, respiratory distress. If we then set that to outborn low acuity, we can see that the pattern changes, and what's prominent is hyperbilirubinemia. Actually, to do the inborn-outborn comparisons, going back to the last chart where we just had admission reasons, it's easier to do inborn, low acuity, respiratory distress, suspected infection of the top runners. And then we could look at, what about our outborn low acuities? And now hyperbilirubinemia comes in as number one. Again, we have suspected infection and respiratory distress. So going back to the heat maps, here you have by birth weight. We could do it by gestational age if we wanted to. And here we're comparing them to all of our regional NICUs, but we could also compare them to the whole system as well to get a sense of what is the distribution in the whole system versus us. And here we happen to have the number of admits, but we might want to know, we've got 17 hyperbilirubinemia. That's because I'm looking at outborn. Let's just look at all of the lower acuity admits. Here's all of the lower acuity admits. And you can see we've got 61 cases for respiratory distress, but we might want to ask ourselves, what's the mean length of stay? So we can do that. We can go mean length of stay. Oh, wow, that's a whole different picture when we look at that. The mean length of stay, as you might expect, is really accelerated in the kids who are at younger gestational ages. And now, look at that, cardiac events, 31 days, hypoglycemia, 35 days. These are pretty long mean lengths of stay. But one of the things we've never looked at is how much work do we have to put into these kids? So we could then go and click on the total number of NICU days that were devoted to these various diagnoses at various birth gestational ages or birth weights. So here's your birth weights, and again, this is pretty incredible that for respiratory distress in these larger kids, we devoted 803 work days to them. Hypoglycemia is only 382, and then some of the lower work days like temperature instability, very few work days for these kids, 26 and 23. Whereas if we look at 502 and 599 work days for suspected infection in these low-risk kids. So I think these heat maps really give you an incredible picture of who you're caring for, how many you're caring for, what's their mean length of stay, but even more importantly, how many days of work are you caring for these various diagnoses in these various birth weight or gestational age categories. The last thing I didn't want to show is daily occupancy. One of the things from a QI perspective that's fun to look at is we know that when our daily census really flies up or and we're really overworked, that's the most likely time to have a breakdown in our quality. And so one of the things that you would use the daily occupancy for is if all of a sudden you found on your run charts or your control charts that you were out of bounds, and all of a sudden you had more infections or more things than would ever be expected, you could then go to this chart and see whether your occupancy was really high on that particular day, because we know there's a relationship between high occupancy and some of our best practices softening up. So 2 reasons to go to the all baby data set. 1 is so you can have a better insight on who you're taking care of, and 2, so you don't have to worry about filling out all those little numbers on the CCS form. In that the all baby data set has all those numbers and can spit them out to build a report that you can then just review and give us permission to pass it on to CCS. What you put in the all baby data set that is applicable to the high risk babies automatically gets transferred. So there's no double entry involved. If you need a little help, give us a message and we'll get on with you and try to demonstrate some of the things and ask your questions so that this becomes a real working tool for you. I think you're really going to love the Focusboards and the All Baby data set.